He's a liar, a con artist, and a snitch. His testimony could soon send a man to his death. Published by He's a liar, a con artist, and a snitch. His testimony could soon send a man to his death. Published by ProPublica and the New York Times Magazine. Written by Pamela Koloff. When Detective John Halliday paid a visit to the Pinellas County Jail on December 4, 1986, his highest-profile murder case was in trouble. Halliday, who was 35 and investigated homicides for the local sheriff's office, had spent more than a decade policing Pinellas County, a peninsula edged by white sugar sand beaches on Florida's Gulf Coast, west of Tampa. It is a place that outpaces virtually all other counties in the nation in the number of defendants it has sentenced to death. Prosecutors who pursued the biggest cases there in the 1980s relied on Halliday, who embodied the county's law and order ethos. Powerfully built and 6'4", with a mane of dirty blonde hair and a tan mustache, he was skilled at marshaling the facts that prosecutors needed to win convictions. He had worked the case for the past year and a half, ever since the body of a 14-year-old girl named Shelley Boggio was found, nude, floating in an inland waterway near the town of Indian Rocks Beach. Her murder was singular in its violence. Her body bore 31 stab wounds, many of them to her hands, as if she had tried to shield herself from the ferocity of the attack. She was most likely still alive, the medical examiner determined, when she was dragged into the water and left to drown. Her older sister identified her by the silver ring, eagle-shaped and inset with turquoise, that she wore on her left hand. The crime scene yielded few clues. No murder weapon was left behind, and no fingerprints or other forensic evidence was recovered. If Boggio was sexually assaulted, the medical examiner found, any trace of sperm may have been washed away during her time in the water. It was one of Pinellas County's cruelest murders, the St. Petersburg Times observed, and there was little evidence. Halliday's investigation quickly zeroed in on two men, Jack Piercy and James Dailey, who lived together and were new to Pinellas County. The facts, what few there were, pointed overwhelmingly to Piercy, a 29-year-old construction worker with a history of arrests for violence against women. Piercy pursued the teenager before her death, and Piercy picked her up on the last afternoon of her life, when she was thumbing a ride with her twin sister and a friend. The girls spent the afternoon and evening with Piercy, Daley, and other housemates, drinking wine coolers and smoking marijuana. After the other two girls went home, Piercy took Boggio to a beachfront bar, where she was last seen, barefoot and disheveled, around midnight. Piercy acknowledged that he drove her to the Lover's Lane along the Intracoastal Waterway where she was killed. But he tried to shift blame to Daley, claiming that he picked up his housemate before he and Boggio headed down to the water. And while Piercy admitted to the police that he stabbed Boggio at least once, and he provided details about the crime that were known only to investigators, he insisted that it was Daley who was the actual killer. This was all that connected Daley, a 38-year-old itinerant Vietnam veteran, to the crime, the word of its prime suspect. No physical or forensic evidence linked him to the murder, nor did any discernible motive. He would later say he had been asleep in the early morning hours when Piercy was out alone with Boggio, only to be awakened by Piercy, who said he needed to talk. Piercy drove him to a nearby causeway, where they drank beer and smoked a few joints at the water's edge. Piercy's girlfriend, and a longtime friend of Piercy's, said they saw the two men come home together that morning, hours before Boggio's body was found, and that Daley's jeans were wet. The state attorney's office in Clearwater pressed forward with the most serious charge it could bring against the men, ensuring that they would be tried for first-degree murder, a crime punishable by death. Piercy's trial came first and ended with a guilty verdict in November 1986, but at the penalty phase, the jury recommended that he be sentenced to life in prison. It was a blow to the state attorney's office, which would argue, in a forceful sentencing memo to the court, that no evidence exists that Piercy was not the main actor in this child's brutal murder. Piercy had dodged the electric chair after participating in, and most likely carrying out, one of the county's most monstrous crimes. Prosecutors had only one more chance to secure a death sentence for Boggio's murder. 10 days after the conclusion of Piercy's trial, Halliday visited the Pinellas County Jail. At his direction, jailers began pulling inmates who were housed near Daley out of their cells. One by one, the men were taken to a small, windowless room where Halliday was waiting. He pressed each man for information. Had Daley ever talked about his case? Ever admitted to anything? 4 men who were questioned that day testified at a 2018 evidentiary hearing to the same unsettling detail in the interview room. Newspaper articles about Boggio's murder were laid out conspicuously before them. I got a very uneasy feeling looking at the newspaper articles, Michael Sorrentino, one of the 4, testified at the hearing. Had I wanted to say something, or fabricate something, all the tools were there to give them whatever they might be looking for. Halliday testified at the hearing that there were no newspapers in the interview room. Either way, no one gave Halliday any useful information that day. In a slender, lined notebook, the detective recorded what each inmate told him. Nothing, he jotted down after one interview. After others, he wrote, "Said Dailey denies charge, doesn't know a thing, nothing, knows nothing, didn't even know Dailey, stays to himself, knows nothing, refused to come to be interviewed. Wish I could have helped you, but it's a little out of my league." Halliday's visit was a bust. But in the Pinellas County Jail, the word was out. The Boggio case needed a snitch. In jail, it is widely understood that helping prosecutors and the police can earn extraordinary benefits, from reduced sentences to dismissed charges. By the time Dailey's trial began the following summer in Clearwater, in June 1987, no fewer than 3 inmates had come forward claiming to have heard Dailey confess to the killing. The first 2 worked in the jail's law library, where they professed to have heard Dailey say about the murder, "I'm the one that did it." They also told the jury of ferrying several handwritten notes between Dailey and Piercy. In the letters shown to the jury, Dailey appeared eager to appease his co-defendant, whom prosecutors planned to put on the stand. But the 2 jailhouse informants were eclipsed by a 3rd inmate who had contacted Halliday to say that he had some information. He told a much more damning story, one that placed Dailey at the scene of the crime and put the knife in his hand. It was exactly what prosecutors needed. That witness was Paul Skalnick, a familiar figure around the Pinellas County Courthouse. He had appeared before the court numerous times as a jailhouse informant and was skilled at providing the sort of incendiary details that brought a defendant's guilt into sudden, terrible focus. Skalnick began working with Halliday in 1983, when the detective was investigating a triple homicide, and Skalnick helped send 2 men to death row, cementing his status as an invaluable resource. Because he was a known snitch, he was held in protective custody, in a single cell where he was shielded from inmates who might want to do him harm. Despite this considerable impediment, Skalnick claimed, just a few weeks before jury selection in Dailey's trial began, to have procured Dailey's confession. Assistant State Attorney Beverly Andrews called Skalnick to the stand before resting her case on a Friday afternoon, ensuring that Skalnick's words would be left to linger in jurors' minds over the weekend. Piercy, the only person to have offered an account of the murder, had by then refused to testify against Dailey, leaving a gaping hole at the center of the state's case. Skalnick, who was facing 20 years in prison on charges of grand theft, stepped into the void. Dark-haired and stocky, with olive skin that offset his gray-blue eyes, Skalnick had a wide, expressive face that was malleable like an actor's, registering emotions with almost vaudevillian embellishment. His words had a stagey, yet captivating sincerity. Andrews began by leading him through a series of questions that were designed to establish his trustworthiness. No, he had not been promised anything in return for his testimony, he assured the jury solemnly. And yes, he conceded, he had been convicted of some felonies, 5 or 6 if I am not mistaken, but he was quick to tell the jury that he had not only assisted the state numerous times as a jailhouse informant, he had also once been a police officer. I still do have law enforcement inside of me, he said. The story he told the jury was simple but arresting. He was passing by Daley's cell early one morning, he explained, when Daley sought his counsel. Daley was under the impression that Skalnick had worked as a private investigator, Skalnick said, and wanted his legal advice. It was then, Skalnick testified, as they stood at the bars of Daley's cell, that Daley came clean, confiding that he had stabbed the girl and then thrown the knife away. What Daley said was so hard to comprehend and to accept, he told the jury earnestly. I had seen this gentleman walking in the hallways, laughing and kidding with other inmates, and all of a sudden, to see a man's eyes and to describe how he can stab a young girl, and she was screaming and staring at him and would not die. Were those Mr. Daley's words, as best you can remember? Andrews asked. As best I can recall, Skalnick said gravely. She is screaming, staring at me, and would not die. It didn't matter that Skalnick had few other details about the murder. Any questions as to his truthfulness were put to rest when Andrews called Halliday as her final witness. The detective vouched for Skalnick, testifying that the inmate had supplied him with reliable information in other cases, yielding extremely positive results. Daley would not testify on the advice of his attorneys, but Skalnick offered a vivid first-person account of a confession. In a trial that had been long on conjecture but short on hard evidence, his testimony became the linchpin of the state's case, so much so that Andrews would cite him more than a dozen times in her closing argument. She assured the jury that Skalnick was honest and reliable. It was with that imprimatur of credibility that jurors found Daley guilty. They also recommended, by a rare unanimous vote, that he be executed. Judge Thomas Pennock, Jr. of the Circuit Court formally sentenced Daley to death on August 7, 1987. 5 days later, Skalnick was released from jail. A Florida Parole and Probation Commission memo stated that his release was due to his cooperation with the state attorney's office in the first-degree murder trial. It was a remarkable turn of events given that he had been identified as a flight risk just a year earlier, after violating the terms of his parole. This man has been, is, and always will be a danger to society, his parole officer had warned. Now he was released on his own recognizance and did not have to post bond. Skalnick was a free man. By then, Skalnick had been in and out of jail half a dozen times. One of his earliest brushes with the law came nearly a decade earlier, in Texas, through an unusual series of events that began with a misbegotten Christmas present for his third wife, Rozelle Rogers. Their whirlwind romance started in 1977, when Rogers, a divorced mother of 2, was leading a quiet life near her well-to-do parents in Friendswood, south of Houston. He just came in out of nowhere and swept her off her feet, said Rogers' daughter, Lisa Rogers. At 28, Skalnick already had 2 brief marriages behind him, but Rogers, who knew little about his past, saw the promise of a new future in the magnetic, seemingly worldly man who lavished her with rapturous flattery and told her he was a top executive at Southwest Airlines. He was less conventional than someone in the corporate world. He wore a gold necklace and a diamond-studded watch with his 3-piece suit, but he seemed like a catch. After getting married in Las Vegas, Skalnick moved into Rogers' condo, where he soon established a routine. On weekday mornings, he bounded out the door, briefcase in hand, telling Rogers he was headed to the airport to fly to Dallas, where Southwest is headquartered, and assuring her that he would be back home in time for dinner. He always carried a business-sized checkbook with him, with which he was profligate, treating her to jewelry, stays at posh big city hotels, and box seats at University of Texas football games, where he boasted of once having been a running back for the team. He tried to outdo himself with each ostentatious flourish, giving Rogers not just one, but two brand-new vehicles, a baby blue Lincoln Continental and a customized Dodge van with red velvet curtains and CB radios. Once he presented Lisa, then 14, with a gold nugget Seiko watch that sparkled with diamonds. When the 8th grader asked him, point blank, if it was real, Skalnick grinned and replied, "Looks real to me." Lisa had taken note of Skalnick's idiosyncrasies, how he filched the robes and towels from their luxury hotel rooms and squirreled away the purple velvet bags that his Crown Royal came in after he had drained the bottles. It didn't escape her attention either that he always kept his handgun within reach, even stashing it under the driver's seat when he was behind the wheel. In the months that followed, Skalnick's behavior became more unpredictable, and he began heading out of town on business, he said. Eventually, his absences stretched into weeks and then months until he disappeared altogether. Unknown to Rogers, who would ultimately have to post notices in the newspaper announcing her intent to divorce him, Skalnick had, by the spring of 1978, landed in the Harris County Jail in Houston for passing a dozen bad checks, one of which he had used to buy Rogers a microwave for Christmas. Everything Skalnick had told her was a lie. He had financed their new vehicles and nearly everything else on the strength of her good credit, taking out loans he never paid back, opening credit cards in her name, and draining her checking account. Rogers, who died in 2005, was left reeling. "He wrecked my mom's credit, and he wrecked her life," Lisa said. His arrest was the first time he found himself in serious trouble, though he had been grifting since at least the early 1970s, when he worked as a police officer. He had lasted just 14 months with the Austin Police Department, stepping down in 1973 after he wrote a string of bad checks. After apologizing for any embarrassment he had brought upon the department, he was never charged. He got off easy again when he was arrested for grand larceny in Orange County, Florida 3 years later after he posed as a furniture salesman and pocketed $700 from an unwitting customer. Even though the police found evidence in his car that suggested he was running another scam, he had a stash of checks, IDs, and stationery bearing the seal of the Texas State House of Representatives, he received probation. Only his arrest in Houston in the spring of 1978, which violated the terms of his Florida probation, brought his lucky streak to an end. Suddenly, he was behind bars and looking at jail time in another state. It was here, at the Harris County Jail, that Skalnick's career as an informant began. As he sat contemplating his future, Thomas Hershey, a defendant in a case that was all over the news, was booked into the jail and placed in a nearby cell. Hershey was one of the Moody Park Three, a trio of anti-police brutality activists whom the DA's office had charged with inciting a riot at Moody Park in Houston that left 15 people hospitalized. The uprising came a year after the death of a 23-year-old laborer named Jose Campos Torres at the hands of Houston police officers. The officers who beat Torres and pushed him into a bayou to drown, "Let's see if the wetback can swim," one famously taunted, received only slaps on the wrist. City leaders blamed outside agitators like Hershey, who had called for Torres's killers to be brought to justice, for the riot, rather than acknowledging that years of police brutality pushed the Mexican-American community to its breaking point. To the Moody Park Three's supporters, it was a frame-up. To prosecutors, it was a case they needed to win. Skalnick would later place a call to the DA's office, claiming to have information on the case. Prosecutors put him on the stand when Hershey and his co-defendants Travis Morales and Mara Youngdahl were tried together in May 1979. Skalnick's first time testifying as a jailhouse informant was less sure-footed than his later turns as a witness for the state, but he hewed closely to a storyline that he would use again and again in the years to come. He told the jury that he was standing outside Hershey's cell when the young activist decided to unburden himself and confess that Morales's plan all along had been to incite the Mexican-American youngsters, Skalnick said. As Skalnick spoke, Hershey sat at the defense table in disbelief. "I'd never seen the guy before," Hershey told me. "Never seen his face, didn't know his name." Hershey and his co-defendants were looking at up to 20 years in prison if convicted. We weren't naive, but to actually see this unfold in front of us, to watch him lie when our lives were on the line, was pretty shocking, Hershey said. Skalnick's strategy paid off. Prosecutors prevailed in the end. The Moody Park Three were found guilty, though the jury declined to give them any prison time. After Skalnick spent 2 months in jail in Houston, he was sentenced that November to a year in the Orange County Jail in Florida for violating his probation. But 4 days before Christmas, a Florida Circuit Court judge abruptly reversed course, stating that he had received a recommendation that Skalnick be moved from the jail to a work release program, a privilege normally forbidden to repeat offenders. The judge did not specify whether Texas prosecutors were behind that recommendation, but the lesson was unmistakable. The best way for a man behind bars to help himself was to help prosecutors. Just 2 months later, in February 1980, Skalnick was not only out of jail, but also married to a woman who believed that her clean-cut, church-going husband was a law student. It was this marriage, his fourth, that brought him to Pinellas County. While living with her in St. Petersburg, he got engaged to another woman in nearby Largo, telling her he was a Dallas attorney who wanted to move his law practice to Florida. He persuaded her to take out $3,500 in loans to help him set up his new law office, money he promised to pay back but never did. His wife learned of his engagement only when he was arrested for grand theft. Skalnick, who faced up to 5 years in prison, was left in the Pinellas County Jail to await his trial. Skalnick had another plan. As he had done in Houston, he placed a call to prosecutors. So began a years-long working relationship between Skalnick and the state attorney's office in Clearwater, which would extend through much of the 1980s and involve at least 11 local prosecutors. "The state attorney's office has always characterized me as an honest, forthright witness," he later wrote to a judge, "and together we never lost a case." 10 days before his grand theft case went to trial in August 1981, Skalnick provided the state attorney's office with information on 3 different defendants who were charged with murder but whose cases had not yet gone to trial. In return, prosecutors offered him a deal. If he pleaded guilty, they would recommend that he spend no more than 3 years in prison, 2 fewer than he was facing. They also left open the possibility that he could secure a sweeter deal if he cooperated further. Probation was discussed, states a handwritten note in the state attorney's files. Skalnick took the plea, and his sentencing was postponed while he quietly went to work as a jailhouse informant. Prosecutors would hold off on making a sentencing recommendation until they saw exactly how much Skalnick had to offer and how helpful he could be to them. In the meantime, he would remain in jail, a snitch. Skalnick made himself busy that fall and winter and into the following June, testifying for the state in 2 drug trafficking trials and providing a damaging deposition in a high-profile murder case. In each case, Skalnick could truthfully say under oath that he had not been promised anything in return for his testimony because no specific agreements had yet been struck. The narratives, he told, were strikingly similar, featuring inmates who not only freely admitted their guilt, but also did so spontaneously in the same oddly stilted language. In a drug trafficking case that ended in a guilty verdict, Skalnick testified that the defendant had struck up a conversation with him, midway through the accused's trial no less, that began with the declaration, "We were loading the boat with 24,000 pounds of marijuana in Colombia." Skalnick was rewarded on June 30th, 1982, when, with the backing of the state attorney's office, he was sentenced to probation. For someone who had racked up 5 criminal charges in nearly as many years and left the state the last time he was on probation, it was an astonishing feat. Buried deep in thousands of pages of court records spread across 2 states lies evidence to suggest that Skalnick was one of the most prolific and most effective jailhouse informants in American history. "I have placed 34 individuals in prison, including 4 on death row," he boasted in a 1984 letter to Senator Lawton Chiles of Florida in a request for favorable treatment, a number that, while inflated at the time, would ultimately prove accurate. During a single 6-year span, from 1981 to 1987, Skalnick testified or supplied information in at least 37 cases in Pinellas County alone. Many were cases in which people faced the most serious possible charges and the most severe penalties. 18 defendants whose cases Skalnick provided information on were under indictment for murder. A vast majority of their cases ended in convictions or plea deals. 4 were sentenced to death. The state attorney's office in Clearwater, in an emailed statement, said Skalnick independently got fellow inmates to confide in him, then contacted prosecutors or the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. He at no time was an agent of the Sheriff's Office or the state attorney's office, it said. The state attorney's office never provided any leniency to Paul Skalnick in exchange for his testimony. All information provided by Skalnick, the statement said, was independently verified, and the office has never received any information to indicate that his testimony was incorrect. Still, Skalnick's journey through the criminal justice system affords a rare opportunity to see exactly how prosecutors and jailhouse informants work together. These insights are possible because of a rare confluence of forces, including Skalnick's extensive history of informing and Florida's strong public record laws, which enabled ProPublica and the New York Times Magazine to obtain thousands of pages of police reports, arrest records, jail logs, probation and parole records, pre-trial interviews, and correspondence that document his activity in sometimes granular detail. This reporting follows decades of litigation waged by public defenders and pro bono attorneys representing death row inmates in whose cases Skalnick played a role. The full record provides a vivid picture of how jailhouse informants are used, showing which benefits Skalnick was afforded, which crimes he eluded punishment for, and, most clearly, how the state attorney's office put this witness, who was dubbed a con man extraordinaire, in the words of one warrant for his arrest, on the stand in cases where defendants' lives hung in the balance. In response to detailed questions about the Daley trial, Beverly Andrews, now Beverly Andringa, who prosecuted the case, said in an email that she has very little memory of the more than 30-year-old case, but she said that she never willfully and intentionally provided false evidence or testimony to a court or jury on any case. Robert Heyman, a prosecutor who tried the case with her, pointed out that Skalnick had been vetted by law enforcement and called to testify by other prosecutors. "If we did not believe that his testimony was truthful, we wouldn't have had him testify," Heyman said. Yet, again and again, prosecutors have shown that they are willing to rely on the testimony of witnesses like Skalnick, even in cases in which the death penalty is in play. Jailhouse informants are common in prosecutions of very serious crimes, including ones that carry life and even death sentences, said Michelle Feldman, the Innocence Project's state campaigns director, whose work focuses on legislative efforts to regulate the use of jailhouse informants. Since the courts don't track them, it's hard to say which jurisdictions use them the most or how often they testify. but they remain an entrenched feature of criminal prosecutions, even though they are the most unreliable kind of witnesses. What makes them so unreliable, she emphasized, is the widespread understanding in jail that prosecutors can offer substantial benefits in exchange for cooperation. Rewards that may include not just reduced sentences or improved jail conditions, but cash payments. There is a very strong incentive to lie and very little disincentive not to, Feldman said. The consequences of snitch testimony can be catastrophic. Of the 367 DNA exonerations in the United States to date, jailhouse informants played a role in nearly 1 in 5 of the underlying wrongful convictions. A seminal 2004 study conducted by Northwestern Law School's Center on Wrongful Convictions found that testimony from jailhouse snitches and other criminal informants was the leading cause of wrongful convictions in capital cases. Today, nearly a quarter of death row exonerations, 22%, stem from cases in which prosecutors relied on a jailhouse informant. Informants often end up on the stand when other evidence is weak. A case that is based on rigorous forensic work or witness testimony that can be independently corroborated does not need a snitch to paper over the gaps. The most unreliable witnesses, then, may testify in the least sound cases, and in cases in which the stakes are the highest. Given how opaque and unchecked prosecutors' use of jailhouse informants is, it is impossible to quantify how often they factor into criminal cases. Usually, the only glimpse of the government's reliance on them comes when a scandal erupts, as it did in Los Angeles in the late 1980s after a serial snitch named Leslie Vernon White went public. In an interview for 60 Minutes, he demonstrated how easy it was to manufacture a confession, procuring key details of a murder on camera in the course of just a few phone calls. His claims led to a grand jury investigation into jailhouse informants that was the first of its kind. The inquiry exposed extensive prosecutorial misconduct and the widespread misuse of jailhouse informants, who had concocted persuasive-sounding confessions in a variety of ingenious ways. Some impersonated law enforcement officers to make calls eliciting information. Others sent friends and relatives to court hearings to suss out other defendants' cases. Many were fed information by law enforcement, who shared arrest reports, photos, and case files with inmates, even escorting them to crime scenes so they could better shape their testimony to fit the evidence. The grand jury identified upward of 150 cases, and perhaps as many as 250, that were affected. In the wake of the scandal, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office instituted reforms to provide more oversight of prosecutors who put jailhouse informants on the stand. But, beyond Los Angeles, little changed. The Chicago Tribune raised the alarm in 1999 when it highlighted prosecutors' over-reliance on jailhouse informants in death penalty cases in Illinois, and found that such testimony had helped convict or condemn 4 of the state's 12 death row exonerees. In the aftermath of the report, which identified numerous problems with the death penalty in Illinois, Governor George Ryan declared a statewide moratorium on executions. But nationally, the harms of jailhouse informants went unaddressed. In the 1990s and 2000s, the accrual of DNA exonerations, made possible by the advent of a then-new and revelatory technology, laid bare the fact that snitch testimony had contributed to wrongful convictions across the country. Nevertheless, the authors of the 2004 Northwestern Law Study were fatalistic, writing, "The reality is that neither legislatures nor courts are about to ban snitch testimony in the prevailing tough-on-crime political climate." In 2014, a quarter-century after the Los Angeles snitch scandal began, another scandal broke in neighboring Orange County. A local public defender was able to show that for years, sheriff's deputies had engaged in a practice of strategically planting informants in the cells of defendants who were awaiting trial. Inmates who produced incriminating information, including confessions they elicited with threats of violence, were rewarded with money and sentence reductions. Orange County's top prosecutors and law enforcement officials were implicated, and according to a pending ACLU lawsuit against the county's district attorney's office and sheriff's department, at least 140 cases were tainted. Though no law enforcement officials were fired or disciplined, the scandal contributed to voters' ouster of Orange County's longtime district attorney Tony Rackauckus, and convictions in dozens of cases were subsequently challenged. Alexandra Natapoff, a law professor at the University of California, Irvine, who is the nation's foremost legal scholar on criminal informants, said the parallels between the two California scandals show how little has changed in 30 years, and how little we know about how often jailhouse informants continue to be used across the country. In Orange County, a sophisticated jailhouse informant system remained under the radar, not disclosed in court cases for decades, Natapoff said. The accident is that we know about it, not that it happened. The benefits jailhouse informants receive, she added, are rarely apparent to jurors because prosecutors often bestow them on the back end, after a trial's conclusion. Many jailhouse informants can truthfully state to the jury that they have not been promised any benefit, even though realistically they expect to be compensated for their testimony, Natapoff said. Ironically, jurors will often be the only people in the courtroom who do not understand this arrangement. Karen Parker was 12 when she crossed paths with Skalnick. He appeared out of nowhere, she told me. He befriended my mom and dad, and suddenly he was in our life. It was July 1982, the middle of a long and restive summer, and Parker usually passed the time at the beach or riding her bike around her working-class neighborhood in Seminole, south of Clearwater. Skalnick, who had found work with her next-door neighbor's brother, a private investigator, was often around, holding her father rapt with stories of his days as a police officer. He struck Parker as impossibly cool, a sharp dresser with a certain louche charm. He was magnetic, out of the ordinary, not like other people I knew, she said. And he was very attentive to me. He'd give me that extra look, and I had the sense that he was interested. I was drawn in. She was thirsty for male approval. At home, where her father was stern and critical, she received none. To Parker, Skalnick's attention was exhilarating. One day that July, she went fishing with her next-door neighbors in Largo, and Skalnick joined them for the outing. It was dark when they returned to Seminole, and he summoned her to come sit beside him in the front seat of his silver Cadillac. By then, her neighbors had gone inside. Suddenly, he was kissing Parker, his hands slipping under her t-shirt. Then his fingers were inside her. He took my hand and put it on his penis, she said. He had me masturbate him until he ejaculated. Parker had just finished the 7th grade. Skalnick was 32. His voice turned cold afterward, she said, when he advised her, obliquely, to keep quiet. One of these days you're going to open your mouth too many times, he said, suggesting that doing so could land her in JDC, juvenile detention. The only one who is going to be in trouble is you. Parker spoke to only one person about what had happened, a 16-year-old girl who lived next door and glimpsed Skalnick kissing her in the car. But the story eventually leaked out later that year, after Skalnick was arrested for grand theft. Upon learning of the assault, Parker's parents took her to the sheriff's office. Skalnick was charged in December 1982 with lewd and lascivious conduct on a child under 14, a felony punishable by up to 15 years in prison. The case against him was a strong one. Parker's descriptions of the assault was bolstered by the eyewitness account from the 16-year-old neighbor she confided in and another from the 16-year-old's boyfriend, who, as he approached the car, saw movement in the suspect's lap, suspect's hand or victim's, of a masturbatory nature, according to the police report. And, unlike some victims of child sexual abuse, Parker was old enough to clearly articulate what happened to her and was willing to testify. "I don't think it is right that he is calling me a liar, and I am not," she told investigators. There were also the results of a polygraph examination that the sheriff's office administered to Parker. "Have you ever heard of a 12-year-old girl having to take a polygraph?" she asked me, still incredulous. Polygraphs have since been shown to be unreliable and are not generally admissible in court, but they were central to many law enforcement agencies' investigations in the 1980s. The fact that Parker passed and that her account of the assault was found to be truthful was meaningful at the time. All told, prosecutors had a case they could take to trial. Child sexual assault cases are routinely prosecuted on far less. But the state attorney's office would ultimately decline to try Skalnick. In a plea hearing that took place on March 10, 1983, prosecutors agreed to dismiss the molestation charge. In return, Skalnick pleaded no contest to new charges of grand theft, for which he had been arrested the previous November. True to form, Skalnick had tricked a woman into giving him nearly $5,000 on the promise of starting a travel agency together, and defrauded a couple out of more than $20,000 by assuring them that he could deliver discounted cars that were forfeited to the state in narcotics cases, all of which violated his probation in the previous grand theft case involving his fiancée. These charges carried much lighter punishments than child molestation. The state attorneys noticed the court dismissing the lewd and lascivious conduct charge said simply, "There is insufficient evidence available at this time." Skalnick took the plea deal, for which he received concurrent 5-year sentences. But instead of being sent to state prison to serve out his punishment, he would remain in the Pinellas County Jail, where he could continue to work as a jailhouse informant, gathering information on defendants who had not yet gone to trial. Prosecutors argued that keeping him in the county jail was for his safety, given that his testimony had helped send men to prison. And with the child molestation charge out of the way, Skalnick came across to jurors as a far more innocuous figure than he actually was. That is, as a former police officer turned small-time scam artist, rather than as a child molester. Parker belongs to a group of crime victims who remain forgotten in a criminal justice system that allows jailhouse informants to be released and to continue committing crimes because prosecutors exchanged leniency for their testimony. Parker never knew about prosecutors' deals with Skalnick, only that he was never punished for what he did to her. "No one ever said, 'That's wrong,'" she told me. "The message I got was that what he did was okay, that it wasn't serious, it wasn't a crime." In her father's eyes, she said, it was she who was to blame for what happened. "Everyone liked Paul, and they believed Paul, and I was seen as the troublemaker," she said. After Skalnick's arrest, her father's harsh criticism of her escalated until it became unbearable. Parker ran away the following year when she was 13 and left home for good when she was 14, taking refuge at a runaway shelter. "I didn't trust anyone for a long, long time," she said. Skalnick, meanwhile, continued to be valuable to the state attorney's office after his molestation charge was dismissed in 1983. That year and the next, he testified in 4 high-profile murder trials, 3 of which ended with death sentences. All 3 of the men who were condemned to die, Richard Cooper, Kenneth Gardner, and J.D. Walton, had, without question, been present at the scenes of the horrendous crimes they stood accused of. But because several people were charged in connection to each murder, the key question at Cooper's, Gardner's, and Walton's trials was one of culpability. How much of a role did the accused play, and were his actions egregious enough to warrant the electric chair? Prosecutors used Skalnick to show that each man was not just guilty, but also deserved death. At the time, in the 1980s, appearing soft on crime was a surefire way to be voted out of office. In Florida, prosecutors, judges, the attorney general, the governor, everyone wanted to prove how tough they were, Stephen Bright told me. Bright, one of the nation's preeminent capital defense attorneys and a visiting lecturer at Yale Law School, went to Clearwater in 1985 to challenge the conviction and death sentence of a man who was bound for the electric chair. Governor Bob Graham of Florida, who earned the nickname Governor Jello because he was seen as weak and ineffective, reinvented himself by signing death warrants, increasing the number of warrants he signed when he ran for re-election in 1982 and again when he ran for Senate in 1986. In Florida, Bright added, it seemed like there couldn't be enough death sentences. Even so, Pinellas County stood out. For a 3-year period from 1982 to 1984, it sent more people to death row than any other county in Florida. At the time, the state attorney's office was run by a hard-charging prosecutor named James T. Russell, who stood just 5'5" but enjoyed a fearsome reputation. A perfectionist whose moral universe had no shades of gray, Russell pursued a law and order agenda that appealed to his constituents, who were disproportionately older and overwhelmingly white. Put more criminals in prison, and there will be less crime on the streets, he told a local civic group in 1981, condemning what he perceived to be a system that placed too much emphasis on rehabilitating people who broke the law. Russell died in 2006. Few questioned the bare-knuckled tactics behind his office's conviction rate, which reached 92% in 1990. So fierce was the drive to rack up wins that prosecutors sought the death penalty in nearly every first-degree murder case, according to a 1988 survey by a local public defender, a strategy that allowed them to leverage the threat of the electric chair to extract guilty pleas from defendants. The demand for convictions and long, tough sentences made Skalnick's testimony invaluable. The confessions he recounted were lurid and dramatic, strewn with provocative details that prosecutors used not just to show the guilt of the defendants, but also to establish that they were diabolically evil. Skalnick told of victims begging for their lives and of remorseless killers who laughed after their slaughters, boasting that they had outsmarted prosecutors and the police. Gardner, who was convicted in a grisly stabbing death of a hardware store owner, supposedly bragged to Skalnick, "I killed him, but they'll never prove it." Walton, who was found guilty of carrying out the execution of 3 men after a botched robbery, considered the whole thing a funny joke, Skalnick told jurors. And Cooper, one of Walton's co-defendants, supposedly introduced himself to Skalnick with the brash declaration, "I'm one of the men involved in the triple murder slayings they thought was a mafia gangland killing." Though Cooper might have earned the jury's mercy because he was a teenager, Skalnick turned that potentially mitigating fact on its head by sharing an offhand comment he attributed to Cooper. He said no jury would ever sentence him to the death chair, Skalnick testified, because he's 19 years old and because he's got that little baby face. The jury recommended that Cooper be put to death. Gardner and Cooper would eventually be resentenced to life in prison. The confessions he claimed these men volunteered to him, and that the state attorney's office had him repeat to juries, were all the more extraordinary given that he was held in protective custody and that his reputation as a snitch was well known to other men in the jail. "Beginning to encounter more and more inmates who recognize him," stated a note in his file from January 1983. Nevertheless, Skalnick was sometimes moved closer to or even into the same cell as a defendant in a newsworthy case. Cooper was assigned to a 2-man cell with Skalnick. Gardner was later assigned to a cell that adjoined Skalnick's. It was during their brief time in proximity to him that each supposedly came clean. A 3rd inmate, a co-defendant of Cooper's named Terry Van Royal, protested when Skalnick was moved into his cell. "I told the guard I would not be in the same cell with him," Van Royal later wrote in an affidavit, "because I knew who he was and what he did." If defense attorneys tried to suggest that Skalnick's preternatural ability to extract men's most closely held secrets was too good to be true, Skalnick would insist that he stood to gain nothing from his testimony, as he did during the 1983 murder trial of Freddie Gaines. A 24-year-old handyman, Gaines was charged with stabbing his girlfriend's ex-lover to death in a bar brawl, a chance encounter, Gaines told the jury, that turned violent. But Skalnick's testimony jettisoned any notion that Gaines acted spontaneously. To hear him tell it, Gaines had carried out a calculated, cold-blooded murder. Skalnick said Gaines boasted of bringing a knife to the bar and seeking out the victim, telling Skalnick that he should have been charged with open-heart surgery. Skalnick's voice swelled with emotion as he spoke, so much that he once appeared to be on the brink of tears. Gaines told me that he was floored when he heard Skalnick testify, and that he leaned over and told his lawyer, "He's sitting right there telling a lie. Me and this man ain't never talked before." But Skalnick's testimony was effective, recasting a possible crime of passion into a premeditated execution, a distinction that would help earn Gaines a conviction for first-degree murder and a life sentence, rather than a lesser charge like manslaughter, which carried a penalty of up to 15 years. Skalnick assured the jury that he had come forward with no other motive than to preserve public safety. "I used to be a police officer," he said, adding that he became an informant after hearing other men in the jail brag that they were going to beat their charges. Assistant State Attorney Bruce Young bolstered the idea that Skalnick's intentions were selfless. "It's your understanding that nothing can be done for you as far as eliminating or reducing your sentence?" Young asked. "That's correct," Skalnick replied. Young continued, "Even if your lawyer wanted to go in front of a judge, the judge would have no jurisdiction to reduce the sentence. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Skalnick said with a note of resignation. "That's correct." Just 3 months later, Young wrote to the Florida Department of Corrections to request leniency. "Mr. Skalnick has been a state witness in a number of very important cases, including several first-degree murder cases, and his testimony has been honest and truthful in all cases," Young said. Expressing concern for Skalnick's safety, he asked that his star witness not be sent to state prison, but remain in the jail. Better yet, Young proposed, the state of Florida could simply release him. "If Mr. Skalnick is eligible for parole," he wrote, "I would argue that Mr. Skalnick be considered for parole." Young did not respond to detailed requests for comment. One of Skalnick's most loyal supporters would also go to bat for him. John Halliday, the detective who previously worked with Skalnick and would later receive key information from him in the Daley case, called the parole board that fall on his behalf. "Mr. Halliday would like the commission to know the subject has been of great assistance to the sheriff's office," reads an interoffice memo documenting the call. Halliday wrote directly to a parole commissioner the next month, urging him to consider Skalnick for release. "I have never done this for an inmate during my 10 years in law enforcement," Halliday added. Halliday declined to review a detailed request for comment, referring it to Keith Johnson, an investigator for the state attorney's office. Johnson referred the request to the state attorney's office, which declined to comment about Halliday, as did a spokeswoman for the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, who noted that the cases in question took place long ago. On March 19, 1985, Skalnick was paroled. Having served about half of his 5-year sentence for grand theft, he was free, despite assessments from the Department of Corrections that judged him to be a con artist of the highest degree who was at high risk of further unlawful behavior. Sure enough, after Skalnick was released, he cheated an elderly woman out of tens of thousands of dollars for 2 Lincoln Town cars he never delivered, conned another woman out of thousands more with a phony real estate deal, and duped a jewelry store clerk into taking a check from what turned out to be a defunct bank account for a $6,100 gold Rolex. He also married and divorced his 5th wife. By November 24, 1986, he was back in the Pinellas County Jail, where he would claim, the following summer, to have procured James Dailey's confession. Mr. Skalnick's deceitful nature knows no bounds. an unknown person wrote in a handwritten letter to the state attorney's office, urging prosecutors to punish him as harshly as the law would allow. How many chances will this man be given? How many more people will he hurt and victimize? As reform-minded prosecutors have swept into office over the past 5 years in cities like Chicago, St. Louis, Dallas, Philadelphia, and Boston, some district attorneys' offices have begun to reevaluate the way they have always done business. People in these communities have made very clear that a win-at-all-costs approach is not what they want anymore and does not make them safer, said Miriam Krinsky, a former federal prosecutor and executive director of Fair and Just Prosecution, a network for progressive prosecutors. In an effort to stem mass incarceration, reformers have focused their energy on trying to address the big structural problems that most directly affect people's liberty, like changing the cash bail system and diverting defendants to drug treatment instead of prison. So far, the use of jailhouse informants has received relatively little consideration. It's an issue that is just starting to gain attention, Krinsky said. There is a new dialogue about whether prosecutors should institute safeguards that would allow them to continue using jailhouse informants but proceed with caution, or whether to steer clear of jailhouse informants completely. In some state legislatures, the idea of bringing greater scrutiny to jailhouse informants has slowly begun to gain traction. In 2017, Texas lawmakers tried to strip away the secretive nature of snitch deals by compelling prosecutors to keep track of and disclose the sort of rudimentary information that defendants and their lawyers are often lacking. This includes a full accounting of the benefits that jailhouse informants have received for their testimony, their criminal records, and the previous cases in which they testified. Last year, Illinois passed legislation that requires judges to hold pretrial reliability hearings to evaluate whether informants, in light of the benefits they have been promised and their histories as informants, should be allowed to testify. In July, Connecticut became the first state to enact a statewide tracking system for jailhouse informants that documents where and when such witnesses have previously testified and what benefits they received in return. Florida took action after a staggering number of its death row inmates were exonerated. To date, 29 condemned men have been cleared of their convictions, more than in any other state. A commission appointed by the Florida Supreme Court to study wrongful convictions recommended that prosecutors disclose the deals they make with jailhouse informants, and in response, the court changed the rules of criminal procedure in 2014 to require the disclosure of such deals, as well as other details related to the informant. The new requirement was intended to introduce transparency, but, in practice, it does not address the common problem that prosecutors may not need to make explicit promises at all, because the potential for leniency is implicit and well understood. Reformers hope that new legislation, though imperfect, could still deter prosecutors from relying on jailhouse informants. When you put reforms in place that require tracking and disclosing information about these witnesses, what often comes to light is a good deal of information that could discourage prosecutors from wanting to move forward, says Rebecca Brown, Director of Policy for the Innocence Project. Once they have a fuller understanding of all the factors that would underlie that informant's testimony, they have to confront questions like, is this reliable enough to move forward with? But in a vast majority of states, no reforms have been passed at all. Perjury charges for jailhouse snitches are very rare, even when their testimony is later proved to have been demonstratively false. So, too, are any meaningful consequences for prosecutors who fail to disclose agreements made with a jailhouse informant at the time of trial, or who mislead juries into thinking that an informant will not receive rewards after testifying, or who conceal facts about a jailhouse informant's criminal history that might undermine his credibility. No legislation has yet addressed the outsized but largely invisible role that jailhouse informants play in plea deals, in which prosecutors may use the mere specter of an informant's future testimony to intimidate defendants into not taking their cases to trial. And more radical ideas, like an outright ban on jailhouse informants in capital cases, have stalled, allowing prosecutors to continue using snitch testimony to secure the starkest, most irrevocable punishment. On August 7, 1987, 5 weeks after James Dailey's trial ended in a guilty verdict, the 41-year-old Vietnam veteran came to court to be formally sentenced to death. He had remained mute throughout his trial, but that day he finally rose to speak. Tall and angular, with dark hair and a long, mournful face, he began by recognizing the terrible kind of pain Shelley Boggio's murder had caused her twin sister, and the anguish felt by her family members, who sat in the courtroom weeping. "I say these things as a caring human being and as a person wrongfully convicted of this heinous crime," he declared. He had been condemned by Pinellas County's win-at-all-costs system of justice, he said, in which truth is allowed to be manipulated and paid liars are allowed to testify. His trial, he added before he was led away in shackles, had been a mockery of justice. Skalnick, who was released 5 days later, was supposed to be back in court that October for his trial on charges of grand theft. But by the time his trial date rolled around, he had skipped town, having absconded with a rented Lincoln Town car shortly before he was due to marry a woman who believed he worked undercover for the FBI. Prosecutors were left in the lurch. Their star witness, who was slated to testify in 3 coming murder trials, was suddenly a fugitive from justice. Skalnick, meanwhile, was hiding out in Austin, Texas, where he was busy practicing a sort of absurdist performance art. Passing himself off as J. Paul Bourne, a high roller who was flush with oil money, he managed to buy $27,000 worth of jewelry with forged checks while also running a new unknown type scam, according to documents from the Travis County District Attorney's Office. A con that involved opening bank accounts on the promise that millions of dollars would be wired in. He also married, and soon divorced, his 6th wife. Following his arrest on a forgery charge in February 1988, he tried to reprise his role as a snitch, but an assistant district attorney in Austin saw what should have been clear to any prosecutor. Skalnick, she warned in an inter-office memo, is a big con artist. Skalnick was soon extradited back to Florida, where he was booked, once again, into the Pinellas County Jail. By then, his relationship with the state attorney's office had soured, his decision to bolt to Texas having made a farce of the trust it had put in him. But if prosecutors thought they could distance themselves from Skalnick, they had failed to discern the game he was playing. When they balked at his demands for a lenient plea deal in the summer of 1988, he turned on them. With the help of his public defender, Skalnick filed a motion with the trial court in which he claimed a history of extensive prosecutorial misconduct. In the motion, he asserted that prosecutors had coached him on how to testify in numerous cases so as to give jurors the false impression that he had actually heard all these confessions and had no agreement with the state for a reward for his testimony. Prosecutors knew of the potential questionability of said confessions, the motion charged. Skalnick provided the names of 11 prosecutors whom he accused of misconduct, but provided few specifics. He claimed to have given information or testimony in more than 50 cases, and suggested that much of that evidence was tainted. Just as the men whom Skalnick leveled outrageous claims against over the years had faced accusations that were maddeningly difficult to disprove, prosecutors found themselves on the defensive, scrambling to discredit what Skalnick claimed was the honest truth. In formal responses submitted to the court, the state attorney's office categorically denied his assertions, dismissing them as falsehoods ranging in degree from gross exaggeration to preposterous fabrication, a richly paradoxical about-face for an office that had asked scores of jurors to take him at his word. Trying to preserve the integrity of the cases Skalnick had participated in, prosecutors simultaneously argued that his earlier testimony as a state witness was credible, was often independently substantiated, and withstood extensive cross-examination. In fact, behind the scenes, an investigator with the state attorney's office had difficulty verifying that Skalnick had provided information that could be independently corroborated. Of the two examples Halliday provided, he said Skalnick's tips led law enforcement to a ski mask worn during the committing of a murder and to a gun used in another killing. Only the claim about the ski mask checked out. Of the other, the investigator wrote, "This information is incorrect. The information from Skalnick was accurate. However, it came months after the gun was retrieved." Skalnick brought forth his grievances, the state attorney's office told the court, only after he failed to blackmail prosecutors into cutting him a favorable deal. Yet, in the end, Skalnick got exactly what he wanted. After Skalnick withdrew his motion claiming that they had engaged in misconduct, he and prosecutors arrived at what appeared to be a mutually beneficial arrangement, one that would both appease Skalnick and send him far from Pinellas County. For a total of 6 felonies, 4 counts of grand theft and 2 counts of failure to appear in court, he would receive a 5-year sentence. He entered his plea on the condition that his sentence be served in Texas, where he had time left on a bail-jumping charge. Skalnick ended up evading even that relatively meager punishment. In November 1989, after completing 7 months in prison in Huntsville, Texas, on the bail-jumping charge, the state of Texas, which never agreed to allow him to serve his Florida sentence there, released him. Ultimately, Florida abandoned its efforts to extradite him. The Commission has received information which has caused it to conclude that return of said person is not warranted, read one notably oblique 1991 Florida Parole Commission memo. Skalnick had been let loose on the world again. In 1991, Misty Anderson was living with her mother and 2 younger sisters in Friendswood, Texas, the same town where Skalnick passed himself off as an airline executive in the late 1970s. Her mother, who declined to be interviewed for this article and whose name is being withheld to protect her privacy, wed Skalnick after a short courtship. She did not know that he was already married, much less that she was his 8th wife. Skalnick married his 7th wife shortly after his release from prison. Masquerading as a prosperous real estate developer, Skalnick lavished Anderson's mother with gifts, big bouquets of roses, jewelry, even a used Jaguar. He also began sowing division between her and her eldest daughter. In his campaign to undermine the 15-year-old, who disliked him from the start, Skalnick accused her of stealing the engagement ring he had given her mother, a ring whose glittering gemstone, he said, was a 7-carat diamond. Anderson, whose most fervent wish was for her parents to get back together, saw Skalnick as an interloper, and a calculating and tacky one at that. She was stunned when he accused her of stealing the ring, which she suspected was actually set with a cubic zirconium. "He said I'd taken it," she told me. "He set me up." As punishment, Skalnick grounded Anderson, insisting that she could be reformed only through a punishing regimen that he ordered her to carry out over her summer vacation, when temperatures soared into the 90s. "Every day I had to dig holes in the ground along our fence line, under the hot sun, with no water," Anderson told me. "I was not allowed to shower, not allowed to brush my teeth. I was only allowed to eat once a day. I would get so faint that I would see stars." When Skalnick permitted her to come inside, she had to stay in her room, shut off from the rest of the world. Only after a month of isolation, when she was at her most desperate and vulnerable, did Skalnick offer her a way out. He came in my bedroom and said, "I have an idea that's going to make things better between us," she said. Anderson did not speak a word about the sexual abuse that followed. I didn't think anyone would believe me, she explained, until late that summer, when she summoned the courage to confide in a family friend. She told me that she had to report the abuse, and that's how it all started, Anderson said. The spell Skalnick seemed to have cast over her mother was, in an instant, broken. As soon as my mother heard what he'd been doing, she called the police, Anderson said. Skalnick was arrested and charged with sexual assault of a child. In the eyes of the law, Skalnick was a first-time sex offender. With a prior conviction for sexual assault of a child, he would have been looking at 25 years to life, said Margaret Hindman, the former assistant district attorney in Galveston County who prosecuted him. Instead, he faced 2 to 20 years. Still, Hindman pursued him with a vigor that Pinellas County prosecutors had not. She was astonished when I told her of Skalnick's long run as a state witness. This guy clearly was grandiose, delusional, and had narcissistic personality disorder, she said. He boasted that he was with the FBI, that he was with the CIA, and none of it checked out. It's hard to believe prosecutors relied on him. Skalnick professed his innocence, but he pleaded no contest in exchange for a 10-year prison sentence, a deal that was not as harsh as Anderson would have liked, though it spared her from having to endure a trial. She was in college when Skalnick first came up for parole, and she wrote to the parole board's members, urging them not to grant him early release, and they abided by her wishes. In 2002, he was released after serving a decade in prison. Rather than register as a sex offender, as he was required to do by law, he simply disappeared. He was arrested the following year in Middlesex County, Massachusetts, just west of Boston, for larceny and forgery after he stole thousands of dollars from unsuspecting clients who had hired him under the false belief that he was an attorney. He pleaded guilty and served time in state prison, then fled the state around 2009 after repeatedly violating the terms of his probation. He managed to live under the radar for the next 6 years in East Texas, where he went by the name E. Paul Smith. Claiming to be an attorney, an undercover Homeland Security agent, an ex-fighter pilot who had been shot down over Vietnam, and a terminally ill cancer patient, he worked a variety of small-time scams. He was writing up people's wills and doing legal work for them and investing their money, though no one ever saw any returns, said Shirley Sadoff, a retired U.S. Marshals senior inspector who began investigating Skalnick in the summer of 2015 after the daughter of one of his love interests figured out his real name and looked up his criminal record. He hurt and used a lot of women, Sadoff added. Everything, even his wedding to a woman named Judy Smith, who would have been his 9th wife, turned out to be a sham, down to the phony marriage license he had her date and sign. She is now Judy Beatty. Paul put just enough truth into a lie to make you believe it, she told me. When law enforcement finally caught up with him that October and arrested him for failing to register as a sex offender, he had over 30 fake IDs in his possession, as well as a framed law school diploma, a legal dictionary embossed with the words E. Paul Smith, Esquire, Attorney at Law, and a handgun. After he was arrested, he asked to speak to law enforcement. He wanted to cut a deal, James Ferris, an investigator with the Panola County Sheriff's Department, told me one morning in his tidy office in Carthage, Texas. He started telling me that he could be useful inside the jail, and I told him I was not interested in speaking with him further. Ferris was emphatic about why he wouldn't want to work with Skalnick. I would never be able to say on the stand that I believed the information he gave me was true and credible. As James Dailey's appeals slowly advanced through the courts, his attorneys at the Capital Collateral Regional Council, a state agency that represents indigent death row inmates, argued that the state had, by putting Skalnick on the stand, used false testimony to convict him. To prove it, they pointed to the claims Skalnick himself made in 1988 when he accused prosecutors of knowing that the confessions he recounted were highly suspect and of concealing from juries the rewards he was given for his testimony. But the courts were indifferent. In a 2007 opinion, the Florida Supreme Court noted that Skalnick's claims of prosecutorial misconduct had never been substantiated. Skalnick disavowed the accusations, read the opinion, and unequivocally stated that they were false. The court also accepted the government's assurances that prosecutors had not engaged in wrongdoing. The prosecutor in Daley's case also testified that she believed Skalnick's testimony to be truthful at the time of trial, its justices wrote in their opinion, and with that, any hope of challenging the veracity of Skalnick's testimony effectively came to an end. 8 years later, in 2015, the Florida Commission on Offender Review declined to recommend Daley's case for a clemency hearing. By then, Daley and another man, J.D. Walton, were the only people Skalnick testified against who remained on death row. Daley's prospects looked grim. After several rounds of appeals, the inexorable fact of his execution loomed. The following year, a new attorney at the CCRC, Chelsea Shirley, started digging into his case. Shirley, who was less than 3 years out of law school, brought fresh eyes and indefatigable energy to the decades-long case file and the effort to win Daley a new trial. At 27, she was younger than the case itself. As Shirley read the numerous accounts that Daley's co-defendant, Jack Piercy, had given about the night of the crime, she saw nothing to suggest that her client had actually taken part in the murder. Through the years, Piercy suggested, but never explicitly said, that he committed this crime by himself, Shirley told me. She was particularly struck by a sworn statement he made to Daley's attorneys in 1993. In it, Piercy divulged that he had been alone with Boggio in the early morning hours of May 6, 1985, making him the last known person to see her alive. He did not say what happened to Boggio, only that he returned home alone. "I went in, got Jim up," Piercy said of Daley. "I told him, 'Come on, let's go smoke a couple joints, drink a beer or something.' He and Daley then drove to a nearby causeway," he said, and began tossing a frisbee around. "He ended up going out in the water," Piercy said, "while we was playing frisbee. We drank beer, we smoked a couple of joints." His account provided an explanation for why Daley's jeans were wet when the two men returned home. It was the same story Daley had told his attorneys before his own trial, a story they warned him sounded too far-fetched to repeat to a jury. On April 20th, 2017, Shirley drove to Sumter Correctional Institution in Bushnell, Florida, an hour north of Tampa, to see Piercy. She was still in the early stages of her investigation. She did not yet know that she would interview 2 men who had been incarcerated with Piercy at different times, who would tell her that Piercy told them Daley had nothing to do with the murder. Shirley went to see Piercy only with the hope that he might be ready, after 30 years, to talk. Piercy, a compact, muscular man with penetrating blue eyes, did not seem surprised that she had come to visit him, and he agreed to meet with her. She began by reviewing several previous accounts he had given of the hours surrounding Boggio's murder, in which he suggested that Daley was at home when he and the teenager headed out into the night. Piercy listened and nodded along. Finally, he asked if he could look at a document she had placed on the table between them. It was an affidavit she had prepared that summarized his previous statements, but it concluded with a declaration that went one step further. James Dailey was not present when Shelley Boggio was killed, it read. I alone am responsible for Shelley Boggio's death. Piercy read the affidavit line by line, and when he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of emotion. "If you can give me a pen, I'll sign it," he told Shirley. He said that he would be willing to testify in court to attest to the accuracy of the affidavit. He just wanted to tell his mother first, he said, to prepare her. It was an astounding admission, and it was enough, Shirley hoped, to win her client a new trial. Piercy's affidavit helped persuade a judge to grant an evidentiary hearing, which was held on January 3, 2018. Shirley brought some additional legal firepower. Laura Fernandez, a clinical lecturer and research scholar at Yale Law School, had recently joined Dailey's legal team. She, along with her colleague Sid Oppenheimer, also a Yale-trained lawyer, would become a driving force in the effort to overturn Dailey's conviction. But when Piercy was called to the stand, he had a change of heart. He explained that he had spoken to someone with the state, he did not specify whom, and was worried about how his testimony could affect his chances for parole. I spoke with all my family, and they told me I needed to do what I thought was right, but that I needed to not make a rash decision, since my parole just got denied for 7 years, he said. His family had advised him, he said, to think about what I was doing. When questioned about the truthfulness of his affidavit, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The judge denied Dailey's bid for a new trial. Dailey's lawyers appealed the decision to the Florida Supreme Court, citing information they had uncovered that, they argued, warranted a new trial. This included revelations about the other 2 jailhouse informants, Pablo de Jesus and James Leitner, who testified against Dailey in 1987. Travis Smith, who was incarcerated at the Pinellas County Jail at the same time as the 2 informants, testified at the evidentiary hearing that he heard them concoct a fictitious story about Dailey, which they planned to take to prosecutors so they could win reduced sentences. Pablo de Jesus died in 2012. Leitner has never publicly recanted his testimony. The state attorney's office's records reflect that de Jesus and Leitner, who told jurors they would receive no reward for their testimony, haggled with prosecutors for reduced sentences in the months leading up to Dailey's trial, a benefit they were each granted after his conviction. But Florida's highest criminal court was unmoved, finding that Smith's account and other evidence Dailey's lawyers presented, including proof that Skalnick misrepresented his criminal record at Dailey's trial, had come to light too late. Dailey neglects to explain why this information could not have been discovered earlier, the court stated in an opinion on October 3rd, in essence blaming Dailey's lawyers for not uncovering facts that prosecutors had spent years obfuscating. It was the end of the road for Dailey. A week earlier, Governor Ron DeSantis had signed his death warrant. This was one of the most gruesome crimes in the history of Pinellas County. DeSantis, a native of the county who grew up just north of Clearwater, later told reporters, "This has been litigated over and over and over, and so at some point you need to do justice." The day and time of Dailey's death was set. His execution was to be carried out on November 7th at 6 p.m. Earlier this fall, I went to see Skalnick in a nursing home in the East Texas town of Corsicana. I found him alone in a drab, cluttered room where the blinds were drawn and a television was on low. He had been released from prison in June after having romanced the mother of another inmate, persuading her to fill his commissary account each week. He lay in bed, shirtless, his thinning gray hair uncombed. Even flat on his back, he cut a shockingly large Falstaffian figure. He was bedridden and ill, though with what he did not say. Every so often, nurses turned him so that he did not develop bed sores, and he sometimes grimaced in pain as he spoke. "I think I'm going to die," he whispered. During the afternoon I spent with him, and on a subsequent visit, it became clear that the last person who could provide a deeper understanding of Paul Skalnick was Skalnick himself. He was a master of misdirection, sidestepping hard questions while portraying himself as the unfairly maligned hero of a story that featured a supporting cast of cunning and vindictive women who were after his riches. Of both charges of child molestation, he insisted that he had been wrongly accused, a victim of girls who lied to the authorities. As we talked, I eyed his tattoos. His right shoulder was emblazoned with United States Marines iconography, and his left shoulder bore the words, "From Texas to Vietnam." Skalnick told me that the scar on his right knee was a result of being shot down over Laos when he fought in the Vietnam War. In fact, his available military records show that he was never on combat duty and never served overseas. He insisted that his testimony in Daley's trial, and in the many other cases he played a role in, had been truthful. "I never lied on the stand," he told me, "at least to the best of my knowledge." When I told him of Daley's impending execution, he was unmoved. But he seemed surprised when I mentioned that Freddie Gaines, the 24-year-old who stabbed his girlfriend's ex-lover in a bar brawl, was still in prison 36 years later. "I think that was a crime of passion," Skalnick said. "He doesn't need life," he added of Gaines's sentence. "I'd give him 10 and let him go home." When I reminded Skalnick that he was the witness whose testimony established premeditation at Gaines's trial, he appeared shocked. "This was your testimony, that he had planned this," I reminded him. "Does that ring true to you? Do you think he told you that?" "No," Skalnick cried. "No." He shook his head resolutely. But when I later tried to return to his apparent recantation, his tone shifted. There is no statute of limitations on perjury in Florida in capital felony cases, and Skalnick was reluctant to reverse himself. "I won't retract what I said," he told me. "Whatever I testified to was fact." Proudly, he told me more than once, "I never lost a case." A week later, I went to Florida State Prison in Rayford, west of Jacksonville, to interview Daley. He had recently caught an unexpected break. On October 23rd, a federal district court judge granted him a limited stay of execution to provide his newly appointed federal attorneys more time to research and present their appeals. Florida State Prison is a monolithic 1960s-era penitentiary hemmed in on all sides by level farmland and coils of razor wire. It is also home to the so-called death house, where inmates with active death warrants are held in the weeks leading up to their executions. For our meeting, Daley was led into the tiny, fluorescent-lit room where final interviews with the condemned are conducted. His hands were manacled to a chain belt at his waist, and his feet were bound by leg irons. At 73, he moved slowly. Behind his thick-framed, prison-issued glasses, he had heavy circles under his eyes. Though Daley had been granted a stay, it was clear that what lay ahead weighed heavily upon him. He had been convicted in the era of Old Sparky, the straight-backed oak chair in which 240 prisoners went to their deaths before 2000, when the Florida legislature made lethal injection the preferred method of execution. As Daley passed days and then weeks in the death house, he experienced another, different kind of torment, the anticipation of waiting. His cell was just 30 feet from the execution chamber. At the time of our interview, he had already been measured for his state-issued burial suit. After more than 3 decades in prison, Daley seemed even-tempered, agreeable, even acquiescent. A lieutenant at the prison would later take me aside to tell me that Daley's disciplinary record was almost non-existent, a feat for anyone who has been incarcerated for so long. I asked Daley about an observation his mother made when she testified during the penalty phase of his trial, hoping to persuade the jury to show him mercy. "I sent 2 lovely young men to the Air Force and Marines," she said of Daley and one of his brothers, "and they came back, and they were different boys." Daley closed his eyes at the memory. "I was messed up," he said. He explained that he was sent off to Bien Hoa, an airbase northeast of Saigon in 1968 during the Tet Offensive. After rocket attacks hit the base, he and other soldiers assisted the injured, men whose limbs had been blown off, their faces ravaged, who drifted between life and death. I wasn't built for that, he told me. I started drinking real bad. To sleep, he had to finish as much as a fifth of alcohol. After 3 tours in Vietnam, he found no relief when he returned home. He sank into addiction and became, he told me, a vagabond. His relationship with Piercy, whom he met in a bar in Kansas, was elemental. We smoked dope together, Daley said simply. He insisted that he had nothing to do with Boggio's murder, and that he believed Piercy was driving Boggio home when Piercy left the house with the teenager, and he went to sleep. Daley understood that any chance of proving his innocence was lost when Skalnick took the stand. I never talked to Paul Skalnick in my life, he told me, his voice rising. We all knew he was an infamous snitch and an ex-police officer. We knew everything about him. We knew how many guys he had snitched on. There wasn't any hiding the fact. The officers would tell us. The officers that worked in the dang jail, they'd say, "Don't talk to him." It was impossible for him to get my confession the way he said he got it, he continued. Even if Skalnick, under protective custody and a stranger to Daley no less, had somehow managed to strike up a conversation, the distance between the two men would have prohibited any sort of meaningful or intimate discussion. He would have had to holler at me, Daley said, and I would have had to speak loudly to confess to him. Daley told me something that he'd thought back to many times over the years. He had been moved from one cell to another shortly before his trial was slated to begin. Jail logs, in which inmates' cell assignments are recorded, confirm that on May 1st, 1987, just 18 days before Daley's scheduled trial, Daley was moved from the lower G wing of the jail to the upper G wing, where Skalnick was held. Right away, I told the sergeant, I said, "Get me out of here," Daley told me. "This is a damn setup." Skalnick claimed to have elicited Daley's confession just 2 days later. 5 days after that, he was talking to the state attorney's office. It was one of many troubling facts that the jury in Daley's trial never heard. Daley's stay of execution will remain in place through December 30th. After that, DeSantis can set a new execution date for as soon as January. When that day comes, Daley will be asked to walk from his cell to the execution chamber, where he will lie down on the gurney. Leather restraining straps will be fastened across his body, and an IV line will be inserted into his arm. Finally, the signal will be given to the executioner to begin the flow of lethal drugs. At that moment, the state of Florida will be asking its citizens to trust that Daley killed Shelley Boggio that night beside the dark water, and that he received a fair trial, and that justice has finally been served. It will be asking them, as it has time and time again, to believe the word of Paul Skalnick. How ProPublica reported this story. To reconstruct Paul Skalnick's 43-year odyssey through the criminal justice system, Pamela Koloff drew on thousands of pages of police reports, arrest records, jail logs, probation and parole records, pre-trial interviews, and correspondence that she uncovered by filing more than 50 public records requests. She also drew on voluminous court records that date back to the 1970s in both Florida and Texas from nearly 40 different criminal cases. Though several central players in the Shelley Boggio case declined to be interviewed, Koloff based her reporting on affidavits and sworn testimony they gave over the years, as well as their notes, reports, and prior statements. Koloff also conducted interviews with dozens of people who crossed paths with Skalnick, some of whom are not named in the story. This includes men who served time in jail with him, victims of his crimes, defendants he testified against, ex-wives, former stepchildren, and ex-fiancés, as well as prosecutors, law enforcement officers, and defense attorneys. Both of the survivors of sexual assault who are mentioned in this story chose to be identified by their married names. This article was read by Julia Whalen.